presentation will not be a high-energy one. For the past 30 years, I've been working with diplomats, spies, military officers, and their entire culture is one of absolute personal control. As a senior Indian diplomat, I said, do you ever lose your temper? He said, only when I'm ordered to do so. And one of the great anecdotes that all defense officers are warned that an Israeli defense minister was once made a speech on radio, and he stammered his way through the speech. And as he left the podium, he left the studio, he got a letter, "You're sacked," from the Prime Minister of Israel, because you have shown weakness to our enemies. And 3 months later, Israel was at war. So that's the kind of culture that I'm coming from. So I'm going to talk now, I will first talk to some degree about what do I get my, yes, here it is. I talk briefly about what the geopolitical landscape as far as India is concerned right now in the world. And then I will talk to a degree about what I see as our government present response to those issues. The first element, the first two main elements that most of you will know is that all of us are used to an international order that is being built around the United States. It was built after World War II, based on the Allied victory. And what most of the international system that I definitely was raised in is one that has been more or less dictated by the United States. And to be fair, we've gotten very used to this. We may complain about the Americans on a number of issues. The Americans complain themselves about what their government does. But it's a system that has been more or less stable until about 10 to 15 years ago. When MH370, the Malaysian Airlines, disappeared over the Indian Ocean, southern Indian Ocean, and we still don't know what happened to that aircraft, the real shock for people in the security system was not that the airplane disappeared, it's that nobody was tracking the aircraft. Because traditionally, everywhere in the world, US Navy ships that were patrolling, and their radars were tracking, and their satellites were passing overhead. There were no ships. The entire South Central Indian Ocean was completely bereft of any military ship patrol. And it was because America was withdrawing. In fact, even a year before that had happened, Americans from the Pentagon offices had come to India and warned them, our Navy is shrinking, our political system no longer has the will to do this, we are leaving the Indian Ocean. There will be large chunks of the world's ocean where America will no longer patrol, America will no longer keep pirates at bay or watch to see whether our disasters are happening. And they basically told the Indian side, you have a choice. The vacuum that will be created will either be filled by pirates from Somalia, or it will be filled by China. We, the Americans, would like you to fill that space, but it's up to you to decide. And it's one of the reasons right now Indian Navy is building 42 warships simultaneously, because we have to fill that vacuum. At least the Indian side believes that. The other part of that, of course, is China. China sees itself as having reached a historical turning point, a point that it lost 200 years ago when the Qing Empire and so on started to fall apart. And it is very clear when you talk to the Chinese, we have 30 years to reassert our historical position as at least the dominant power in Asia, if not preferably the world. But in 30 years, our economy will start to go down as our population ages. And this is the time when what they call the century of humiliation, when they were subjugated by various foreign powers and their empire began to fall apart, is turned around once and for all. Now, needless to say, this automatically runs into a basic problem as far as India is concerned, which is India saying, well, with the Asia domination bit, we're not too happy about. And therefore, automatically, we're seeing a certain degree of an increase in friction since roughly 2008, 2009 between India and China. Not that we had very good relations before that either. But China has asserted itself. It has gone into territorial disputes. It has reopened or even created new territorial disputes with every single one of its maritime neighbors, starting from Japan all the way down to Indonesia in the south. And it has done so deliberately. It has basically said, This is a test to see not about whether you can withstand us, but whether America is in a position to stand up and support you against us. And what we have seen so far is that, more or less, America has not stood up to it with its allies. So the South China Sea, a perfectly normal international body, is now basically half controlled by China. The point of it is not that the South China Sea matters. It's that the South China Sea was a symbol of Chinese power and influence. We can change the map of the world, and your ally, the United States, is unable to stop it. And this is something that began under the, I would argue, under the Obama administration, has now continued with the Trump administration, so far at least. But other parts of the world, in West Asia, or what the Americans call the Middle East, we have seen America basically withdraw completely. America has just said, look, we're not involved in this part of the world anymore. One, we don't need their oil and gas anymore. America has now become a net exporter of oil and gas. But more part, it's a slightly mad part of the planet, and we really don't want to have to deal with this anymore. We spent enough blood and treasure, we're leaving. So what the amazing thing, I remember I once going to Turkey and Israel in a trip, just as the Islamic State was spreading its wings across Iraq and Syria. And I asked the Turks and the Israelis, I said, okay, what's happening here? Why isn't anybody stopping this organization? It's not a major military power. They both said the same thing. They said, yes, what used to happen in the past is the Americans would appear on the scene, it would call the Turks and the Israelis and the Saudis and the Iranians, sometimes the Iranians anyway, bring them to the table and say, okay, this is how we're going to solve this problem. And then this is how what America will do, and this is what you guys have to do. Banged the table and said, okay, it's done. They said this time America's come in and said, you know, the Islamic State is your problem. It's no longer America. We don't want to get involved in this. This is during the Obama administration. The problem, they said, was America said, now it's time for you powers in the region to handle this problem. The real weakness of this was that all the regional powers in the Middle East hate each other. So the Saudis and the Iranians immediately used the Islamic State as a proxy against each other. The Turks and the Israelis were daggers drawn. The Turks tried to overthrow the Syrian government. The Iranians tried to support it. The Saudis came in and tried to support another group of rebels, the al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate. And the result is what we see today in the Middle East, which is complete chaos. And America's response continues to be, not our problem. The same thing that happened when Russia went into the Ukraine. The shock for the Europeans was the American response was, okay, we'll impose some sanctions on Russia, but frankly, you guys need to spend more money on weapons. So anyway, into all of this state of affairs is India. Now, India has had one good thing, that roughly since the Bill Clinton administration, there has been a consistent desire on the American part to work with India, saying that if we are going to pull out, you're the country that, at least in your region, we would like to see slowly build itself up as a power. This has probably peaked under the Bush administration, George Bush, a guy I've met a few times, and I tell you there's no person I've ever met in the White House who has ever been so pro-Indian. But it faltered a little under Obama, but came back in a second term. And now we have Trump, who on at least the strategic side is very pro-Indian, though he's a little worried, he's a little more critical of our trade issues, but I can go into that. So now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi comes to power. This is the closest thing we have to an understanding of what his foreign policy, the core of his foreign policy belief, which is that the ultimate source of Indian strength is its economy. That's logical enough. And therefore, everything I do, especially on the international arena, must be built around trying to build up the economic trajectory that India, it's more than just we'll do a trade and investment and so on. It's about structurally changing the nature of India's capacity to grow, both in terms of technology, investment. There's a whole panoply of areas that we can go into. So this is the closest thing we have to a Modi doctrine. And I'd argue that Modi has, when he became to power, was a rather, should we say, naive about how this worked. He thought as long as you had good economic relations with the country, you pretty much were fine. He thought that even with Pakistan and China, that would be enough. but it's obviously a little more complicated. But now I think this core has now become a lot more, this core belief has become a lot more, should we say, sophisticated. These are the 4 countries, or these are the 3.5 countries, let me just say, that right now are the heart of our foreign policy. Because these are what I call the transformers. These are countries that India believes have committed themselves to making India a great power. Why is this? Because it is in their own interest that India rises. And if you look at the speeches of what actually goes back to Manmohan Singh, has continued under Modi, the prime ministers of India will use the word transformative or transformational relationship only with the top 3 countries that I've mentioned here. The United States is the obvious one that began in the Bush administration. Japan, as we right now know, Shinzo Abe is here. Japan 8 years ago began to conclude that their relationship with China was going to go downhill. They were very uncertain about where the Americans were going. And the more uncertain they became at America, the more they looked at India and said, if we can make you a great power in Asia, then obviously life is much easier for us in Japan. And the Japanese said, we don't do military. I've met Shinzo Abe 7 times, and he told me, we don't do military, unfortunately, because of our own constitution. But what we do see is your fundamental weakness is a lack of an export-oriented, globally competitive manufacturing sector. And part of the reason you don't have that is because you don't have a good infrastructure. So what we will do is try to help build your infrastructure. Hence this enormous plethora of Japanese projects that Delhi, Mumbai, and the Delhi Metro right outside here was in fact the first case study by the Japanese. Can we actually do a project this size in India? Very successful. After that, they rolled out the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor. It goes on. And of course, the bullet train is just the most recent such example. Mostly, a lot of it funded by Japan. The most interesting one for me, because it caught me by surprise, and I thought there'd be very few surprises in Indian foreign policy for somebody who's been covering it for 30 years, was the decision of the Abu Dhabi royal family to join this club. Where Modi, when he was invited, where basically the Abu Dhabi royal family urged Modi to visit, the Indian government said, given your relationship with Pakistan, I mean, this is one of the 3 countries in the world that recognize the original Taliban regime, not really interested. And they basically said, we are prepared to change our policies to make you feel comfortable with us, which is why Dawood Ibrahim is no longer welcome in Dubai, which is why we now have the United Arab Emirates promising to invest in initial tranche of $75 billion in Indian infrastructure. And Modi visited there, and Abu Dhabi said, the new Persian Gulf is now uncertain of where the United States is going. And we see you as the next power here. India is still very reluctant to go into the Persian Gulf, but as Abu Dhabi basically have said, the royal family has said, if you're going to build such a giant navy, you're going to be doing something with it, aren't you? And the Gulf is right next door. We see you as our future. So they are prepared to commit. The 4th country where we're still beginning to move, we still don't describe them as transformational yet, is Germany, where the Germans have now come in and said, and I met the German foreign secretary a few months ago, and he says, we accept that with America becoming so uncertain, and Germany, basically its source of wealth is its trading capacity, we need allies in the maritime and trading sphere, which we didn't have before, and Germany has to start thinking much larger than it is. So Germany actually announced recently an Indian Ocean policy, which when you think about where Germany is and where the Indian Ocean is, you realize how bizarre that is. But that's a sign of where we're going. But Germany is potentially another country we're looking at as a 4th. And again, the Germans have said building you up is what we see as crucial because, as he said, the Chinese may be a great trading nation, but they want to build a trading system that is completely oriented around Chinese values, which Germany doesn't approve of. So, but the heart of Modi's policy is the beginning, the core. As I said, first it's the economy. The second outer shell is our neighbors. I met Modi just after he was elected, and I said, your first state visit is going to be Bhutan. And he told me, he said, you know, the one thing that troubles me more than anything else is that the neighbors, Nepal, this is Bangladesh, all of them who are culturally the closest to us hate us the most. And that has to change. Okay, Pakistan is obviously in a different level, but these smaller neighbors, this has to change, because unless we do that, we can't actually do anything else in the world. So South Asia and Bangladesh, by far, if you ask anybody, if you look at the map of the foreign secretary of the country where he's visiting the most, it's often Bangladesh. Because that has been by far the single most important country we've been working with to try to transform our neighborhood policy. Nepal's been a little bit more difficult. Sri Lanka has been an enormous source of contention between us and China. But South Asia is very much, these neighbors are crucial to our foreign policy right now. Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean is the next area. One of the things the Indian side did is when they looked at what China did in the South China Sea, they said, well, if by chance South China comes into the Indian Ocean, are we in a position to resist China building a footprint? And the alarming conclusion after a very careful stress test was that actually no. India's relationship with the Indian Ocean was actually quite pathetic. We had almost none of any significance. So you'll see the Prime Minister has visited Seychelles, Mauritius, and he's gone to the four African countries he's visited are all Indian Ocean littoral countries. And we have spent a huge amount of time now in these areas trying to build relationships which we didn't have before. I'll give you a simple example. Mozambique, a country that many people in India can't find on the map. We have always had a strong naval relationship with them. But when Mozambique holds an international conference, it is Indian Navy ships that patrol outside their capital and provide the security. We train their army. We train their intelligence service. Somewhere in Delhi is being trained by us. We have now offered to pay money to make their farmers provide pulses for India, mainly to help their farmers, not necessarily just because of us. We are now, a quarter of our FDI into Africa goes into this one country. And we hope to make Mozambique the third largest exporter of LNG in the world. But it'll be Indian companies that play a big role. Mozambique is going to be our aircraft carrier in the South Indian Ocean. At least that's what we plan. But that's a simple example of the kind of stuff India is now working on. But the idea is ultimately, as the Chinese move in, India will be at least in a position to provide an alternative. We can't stop the Chinese, that's not the point. Chinese have now built their first naval base in Djibouti, on the Horn of Africa. We'll probably have two, and we expect two carrier groups out of the 8 the Chinese build will be permanently stationed in the Indian Ocean. Act East, which has been a standard policy, Southeast Asia, but here the focus is now the Bay of Bengal. Bay of Bengal has been the underinvested segment of our coastal area. The Arabian Sea is well developed. Bay of Bengal, India is ironically not a very strong country. And we're spending a lot of time with Myanmar. And as I mentioned, Bangladesh. If you get Bangladesh on board, you can connect to that segment of Southeast Asia by land. And a lot of the roads, projects, aid projects, underwritten, I should add, by Japan, are going through Bangladesh into Myanmar and hopefully all the way into Thailand at some point. But these are the countries we're focusing on, the Act East now. And the Go West, which is basically what I was talking about on West Asia and Abu Dhabi, where we're now, with some reluctance, going into the Persian Gulf more and more. Now, as I've mentioned, China, in many ways, is the heart of what a lot of our geopolitical work is right now. It's a country we have, let's make it clear, China, we accept, is not going to be a friend. It's also not really our enemy, partly because the Chinese hold us in contempt, so they don't really take us too seriously. As it's often said, the Chinese, when they meet Indians, will say, don't forget, we're 5 times your size in GDP, that is. And therefore, you know where your status is. The Chinese are very hierarchical. The US and China are in the same league. India is somewhere down there with Brazil and so on and so forth. But the 4 elements of where I would argue China and India are now heading into greater and greater friction, shall we say, because both sides really don't want to go to war with each other. One is Pakistan, obviously. China has always used Pakistan as an attempt to keep us in check. But now, with the China-Pakistan economic corridor, what is really interesting about that corridor is that the debt quotient, this corridor is going to cost $60 billion. The cost keeps rising. 90% of that is debt the Chinese have loaned to the Pakistanis on Pakistan's book. Pakistan is never going to pay that debt off. And increasingly, more and more, as we saw China do in Sri Lanka, China will essentially take over or demand the ability to control the Pakistan economy. The fact that Pakistan is their ally doesn't really matter to them. They like control, and they believe that if they're giving money, they should do so. And it's already starting to cause protests in Pakistan. The deputy central banker of Pakistan a few months ago protested, saying this is ridiculous. Not only are we paying for the CPEC via debt, all the contracts are going to Chinese companies. We might as well just build it ourselves. And he was immediately sacked. He lost his job 2 weeks later. South China Sea, as I've mentioned, is this the Indian Ocean template for what may happen in the Indian Ocean? It'll be a different template. China has no territorial claims. But the ability to capture and control countries through influence, through finance, is the real weapon that China uses, is something the Indian system is worried about. And again, I'll go back to Sri Lanka a little while later, because that was the first major example that we saw. Then the Belt Road Initiative. As you know, most of you will know, there's a giant infrastructure project, 7 strands, covering all of Asia and a large portion of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific that China has announced. The northern segment is largely already built. India is strongly protesting the southern segment. We can't stop it from being built, but we've made it very clear India will not endorse this. And we are trying to rally other countries to oppose this. One of the countries that recently switched sides is Germany, which initially had endorsed it and has now turned against it. And at the heart of it, I said, is the finance issue. That as far as we can see, when India's mapped it, and we've worked with other countries, it's a straightforward game where China promises investments, converts that investment into debt, uses that portion of that debt to bribe the political class of that country, then turns around and demands assets. And when I say assets, I mean entire ports, roads, highways. And then the last step is, having accomplished that much, they begin to demand that the foreign policy of that country begin to change in the direction China wants. I'm not complaining about what China's doing. This is exactly what great powers do. But ultimately, this is not something India's happy with, and that's where India's concern is. And then finally, of course, I'll talk about there's the Dalai Lama succession, which is going to happen sometime in the next 10 years. And let me be assured, there will be 2 Dalai Lamas, one out of Beijing and one on our side, in contention with each other. Belt Road, let's go back to that again. How are we responding? So besides the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, so building up our internal infrastructure, again, Japan is our big ally in this front. The Sagarmala project, which is the Bay of Bengal area, building up that. So basically you link the northeast of India, the Bay of Bengal, Southeast Asia, and this entire area. In many ways what we're doing, and it's funny when I've talked to Indian officials who are working on all these projects, they said we're actually undoing the partition. Because they said we're finding all the roads and bridges that the British built that we knocked down in 1947. We're actually now having to rebuild from scratch. The Indian Ocean area, again, Mauritius, places like that, we're building IT centers, ports. We're trying to get the Indian private sector to move into these countries. There's a north-south international corridor we're trying to build through Iran, but Iran's a very difficult customer to work with. And finally, we just recently announced, and this will be a big step for us, is the first attempt of India and Japan to work on a connectivity corridor in in another continent, which in this case is Africa. I'll just very quickly skim through defense, because that's a very long and difficult process. We've been trying very hard to develop weapons in our own country. It's been a disaster. We don't even have a good assault. We don't even know how to make an assault rifle. The INSAS rifle is not used for assaults. The AK-47 is by the Indian Army. We import combat boots. We import, when the Gurkhas are the slashed hats, we import even those from Australia. We don't make anything in India. And trying to turn that around has been a big issue, I think, with the government, still struggling. But we're finding new partners in the defense side, in the Africa, the Gulf, many of whom want to buy weapons from us. Unfortunately, we don't have any weapons to sell. But nonetheless, it's an area we're trying very hard to do. We'll see how that goes in the future. Multilateral, what are we doing on the global scale? What can we do to, and it's difficult. We're not, ultimately, given the size of our country, given the fact that we have a history of insularity, we are not very good at multilateralism. But the areas where we are working on, one is to some degree trade and investment, but we're a protectionist country, we have been a protectionist country. Our new Commerce Minister, Suresh Prabhu, has got orders to start to turn that around, and we'll see how that works, but it's not something we're good at. But we will be under pressure, especially from the Trump administration, to start opening up at least on tariffs on manufactured goods. Climate change. Now, this is very interesting. Prime Minister Modi is obsessed with the danger of climate change. This is he told me once, he said, this is my #1 issue. He believes this is the major existential threat India will face. And it is one of the reasons for his renewable energy push and everything else he's doing on the environment. And of course, therefore, it makes us internationally useful because it means countries like the United States and Europe and Japan want to work very closely with us because it's normally pretty hard to find a large developing country prepared to support them on climate change issues and not really demand too much money in return, which is what normally happens. So it's one of the areas where we are potentially going to become a world leader in terms of policy and rule setting. And finally, on the last 2 points, Afghanistan, because it's an important game that's being played now right there. Afghanistan has been a sort of a battle of empires for quite some time now, but right now what we're seeing is that with the Trump administration, with strong support from India, deciding to go back and fight again, not to necessarily defeat the Taliban, but to at least have the Kabul government, which India backs, be able to negotiate a peace agreement from a position of strength. We're now supporting the Americans going in, not with troops, obviously, but with everything else we can. But what we're seeing is a very clear division. Pakistan supporting the Taliban, the Iranians and the Russians who want to hurt America supporting the Pakistanis, India supporting the United States, supported by the Central Asian countries and Uzbekistan, and China, curiously enough, actually coming in and saying, we're trying to build a Pakistan economic corridor here, will you people stop fighting? They want stability, and they're struggling, they don't know how to do this. But it's caused some rifts between Pakistan and China, which we're starting to see on the international arena. For example, these Chinese allowing statements against Lashkar and so on and so forth because they're telling the Pakistanis, this game doesn't support our game. Your old game is bad for our game. And it's now an interesting source of friction between these countries. And then finally, middle power cooperation. If China is going to be a problem and the Americans are out of the game or slowly withdrawing, can we potentially see, and it's one of the things we're debating internally with the Indian system, look at cooperating with Japan, which we are, but also with the Germanys, the Brazils, the middle powers of the world start to work together. It's not easy because we're not used to doing it. We all have our limitations. But it's an area we're starting to work on. Is there going to be a new international, or at least a temporary international order built around this? Well, I'll just end there and say that this is where I would say is a broad outline of what I would call India's present foreign policy issues. There's still about 6 minutes. If there's any questions anybody might have, I'm more than happy to try to answer them. If I can actually see your hands. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and speak. I'll try to repeat your question then. Yeah. Yes. Right. He's asking about the trade deficit, the huge trade deficit, which I think is actually now about $50 billion between India and China. What is India doing about this? Now, India had used anti-dumping and various other trade measures to try and block some Chinese imports. But fundamentally, the fact remains that we actually don't manufacture a lot of the things we're importing. So when you do tariff barriers, you have to make the case before the WTO tribunal that you are being unfairly damaged by Chinese imports. But if you don't even manufacture that product, you have no case. So you have a problem that your manufacturing base is, especially in the field of electronics, which is the primary import that we have from China, but also things like toys and so on. We just don't make them anymore. Or we make so few that it's almost irrelevant. So the present Make in India strategy, part of it has been to raise tariffs, as you know, on cell phones, handphones, so on. But it's been almost impossible to do because the electronics ecosystem requires, among other things, a very good logistics structure, which we just simply don't have. Hopefully, with the arrival of GST and slowly this infrastructure development, we can move in that direction. But fundamentally, our real strategy right now with China is that China doesn't allow us, what are we competitive in services? China doesn't allow our services to operate. Our IT companies can't function there. Even our pharma companies struggle to sell products in China because China has put in so many non-tariff barriers to all of these. So the real Indian strategy so far has been to shift to can we export more to China and fight with them on this issue to try to reduce that trade. But keep in mind, everybody runs a trade deficit with China other than a few countries like South Korea and Japan. But all we want to really do is reduce the Chinese correctly argue that one of the reasons you have a deficit with us is because you don't allow Chinese investment. That if the electronic supply chain moves into India, then automatically on an accounting table, it looks like it's an export from China to, I mean, it becomes a made in India product rather than a made in China product. But then you run into a national security concern. How much Chinese investment? And right now, there's barely $2 billion worth of Chinese FDI. And Chinese companies will say, trying to invest in India, it's one of the most suspicious nations about Chinese investment in the world. So we continue to run into that issue.
What about the Make in India initiative, and as in terms of how much of progress have we made and with specific reference to defense manufacturing?
Not very much progress. Let's put it this way. A simple anecdote. I once went to the upper Yangtze Valley with a group of small and medium enterprise Indian manufacturers who were from, Moradabad and Haryana and so on. And they were off to meet their Chinese competitors because they wanted to strike deals with them about components and so on. And I just accompanied them for almost 4 days. I traveled with them as they went from Chinese factory to Chinese factory, and then I chatted with them afterwards in the evening as to what they saw. And I remember one of them said, who was an auto components manufacturer from Haryana, he says, I was walking through the Chinese factory, and I said, the plant is the same as mine. The workers are actually worse than mine, and the managers are definitely inferior to what I have back in Haryana. But this guy is killing me. And I realized, among other reasons, he said, I was walking by, and I asked a Chinese fellow, where's your generator? Chinese manufacturer, why do I need a generator? I get power from the grid. And he says, I get 5 hours of power a day in Haryana, and this guy gets it all the time. Then he said, how much do you pay for it? And he cited a price. He said it was 1/3 the price I pay in India. Then he said, I asked, how much corporate tax do you pay? And he cited a figure. He said, I'm paying about 35% in India. This guy was paying 16% tax. And then he said, I asked him, I said, where do you sell to? And this manufacturer in Upper Yangtze, which is really, small town China, or we'll say small city China. And he said, this guy said, why, man, don't do too big. I sell to about 40 countries around the world. And he says, my eyes popped out. He says, I can't sell from Haryana to UP. And this guy is selling to 40 countries around the world. And he said, how do you do that? And he said, what do? I have an online website, I strike deals across the world, and then I put the products in my container and I mark it, Bangladesh, Germany, whatever, and it goes. And he says, you just let the container go. And he says, and the Chinese guy's like, what is wrong with you? Of course, if the container is marked, it'll go to Germany, it'll go to Germany. And he told me, he says, man, when a truck from my company leaves Haryana, and it goes to Delhi, I have to monitor it every half an hour to make sure it doesn't disappear along the way. So the transaction costs in the Indian system are so staggeringly high. I mean, that's just a small portion of what I'm talking about, right? But this is just one small idea of this. This is a man who manufactured auto components, was competitive in terms of what he could do as a person to his Chinese counterpart. But the ecosystem in which that Chinese fellow worked was so much better than his in terms of everything that we have to realize Make in India is going to be the outcome. It's not going to be a policy which the government can just say we're going to make in India. It just has to be an outcome of a whole series of policy initiatives, which, to be fair, the Modi government is doing. GST, I think, is going to be one of the biggest. It will massively reduce our logistics costs, for example. But we have to do a whole mess of other things. We have to reduce corporate tax, in my view. It's simply too high compared to the rest of the world. We have to do something about labor reforms in India. I could go on. There's a long list. It'll be a bit-by-bit transformation. And it's one of the reasons the Japanese are here. The Japanese said, you guys are just horrible at this. We are one of the few, we can take on the Chinese, but you guys just have no idea how to do this, and we'll have to build that infrastructure for you. But the soft stuff, like the taxes and so on, you have to do. Obviously, Japan can't dictate it. So it's very slow. Defense and aerospace and space, if you wish, are the three most difficult and most sophisticated technologies in the world. I mean, I once met a company from California, and they make the, as I asked him, I said, what do you do? He says, we make the, when you fire a missile on an aircraft, you know, he says, have you ever watched Top Gun? The thing that releases the missile, that's what we make. That's the only thing we make. The thing that holds the missile. He said, because the instant that pilot fires that missile, that thing has to open. Otherwise, he's doomed, because his missile will blow up on his own aircraft. So we have orders. Doesn't matter what speed the aircraft is going, if it could be in ice, wind, rain, it can even be smashing into a sea wave, a wave of ocean. It can be frozen with ice. It has to open. So we have nanometer capacities on this that it must open. But Pentagon says, we don't care how much it costs, but it must never, ever fail. That's the kind of technology we're looking at, and we're slowly building that into the automobile area. Digital technologies there are actually quite good. But defense, in my view, is extraordinarily difficult. And I think, frankly, the government is a little overreaching itself when it says, let's build a jet engine. Jet engines are built, like 5 countries in the world know how to build a jet. Even the Chinese don't know how to build a jet engine yet. They've tried and failed. But if we could just build guns, artillery, basic stuff like that as a start and work our way up, I'd be very happy. Thank you. I see my time's up.